We've taken a brief look at the useContext hook and the useReducer hook. Now let's use both of these in combination to set up the basic state of our app. We'll start by, in our source folder, removing our app component entirely. We'll remove all of the code, as well as our example with the useContext provider. And instead of importing an app component, we're just going to create it here within the index component, or the index file, I should say. We'll begin by recreating our app component. It'll be a function component, and here's where we're going to use both the useContext hook and the useReducer hook. But the context that we create, as well as the reducer function, will both live in separate files. So in our source folder, we're going to create context.js and reducer.js. So we'll start with context.js, and here's where we're going to create our React context and make it available to other files in order to consume. So we'll import up at the top React. We'll call create context on React, and here within create context we can pass an object and set up some initial state. As I mentioned, we'll be creating a to-dos application, so we'll create a to-dos property on this object, which will be an array, and we'll create a few initial to-dos, which will be objects consisting of a number of properties. First, each to-do will have an ID, so our first to-do will have an ID of 1. We'll have a text property, and say for the first one it's eat breakfast, and we'll have a property which will tell us whether the to-do is complete or not. So for this first one, it'll be false. Then we can copy this and create another one, and a third. So the second one will have an ID of 2. You can give it its own text, say do laundry, and complete will be false again. For the third one, the ID will be 3. The text will be, say, finish project, and complete here will be set to true. So this is our initial state that we're passing to create context, and then we'll get back our to-dos context, and we'll make this available for other components with export default to-dos context. Then in reducer.js we'll create our reducer, and we'll write this as a function declaration, so we can say export default, and once again we'll call this function reducer. It'll take state and an action. We'll set up our switch statement. We'll switch according to the action type for our action, and for now we'll just set up a default case where we're going to return the state that's passed to our reducer. So then back in index.js, we'll first import to-dos context from /context, and then our reducer, which we'll call to-dos reducer from /reducer. Then in our app component we can combine the two. First we'll call useContext. We'll pass in our to-dos context, and from it we'll get our initial state. So once again, all of the initial state that's going to be returned is coming from the call to create context, and the initial state will be the object with the to-dos array in it. So we'll then call useReducer, which will first take our reducer, which we call to-dos reducer, and it needs some state. We'll pass it initial state. And then from useReducer we get state and then the dispatch function. So now using to-dos context, within Render we can create our provider. This will be to-dos context.provider, and we'll wrap our app component with it. But actually, instead of including our provider here in Render like we did before, let's just render the app component, and within its return set up our provider, and then make the state and the dispatch function available to all of the components between these provider tags. So toValue will pass as an object state and dispatch, So we'll include another set of curly braces here. And between the tags, we can just return all of the components in our app, or at least all of the top level components in our app. So we'll first create a components folder for our components to live in. And for now, let's make one component, to-do list, which is where we'll display all of our to-dos. So up at the top, we'll import React. We'll write this as a function component. And I'll actually rewrite this as a function declaration. And we'll make sure to export it with export default. And then in index.js, we can import this component, import to-do list from /components/to-do list, and then put it between our provider tags. And now in to-do list, we want to consume the values that we're passing down, state and dispatch. And when we consume state, we want to display in to-do list our initial to-dos. So from context.js, we need to import our exported to-dos context. So in to-do list, we'll import to-dos context from /context. To consume our context, we'll need the useContext hook. So up at the top of to-do list, we'll call useContext, pass it our entire to-dos context, and we'll get back from this function call the two things that we passed to the value attribute of our provider, state and dispatch. So in to-do list, we can destructure from the object that we get state and dispatch. We won't need dispatch just yet, since we just want to take our state and display our to-dos, our initial to-dos. So we're just going to return a div which will contain a unordered list. And here's where we can take our state. On it we have our to-dos array. We're going to map over our to-dos, where for each to-do we'll have an li, which will have a key prop or a key attribute set to to-do.id. Then within the li for now, we'll include a span, which is where we'll show our to-do text with to-do.text. Now let's save all of our files, head back to our browser, and we should see our initial array of to-dos displayed on the page.